Well, first of all, thanks so much, all of us, when you still stay here with the wonderful and really emotional story from my colleague AIC sharing the victims, particularly with the female in the scam as well. And I want to borrow the keynote speaker this early morning, the same human trafficking, not only one thing, right? Scam also, perhaps. Many things. Well, last but not least, I'm Luong. Thank you so much, Rick, to invite me after over 15 years after graduating my master in Luong. I think it's the first initiative funded by AFP when we involved with the first cohort in the Center for Transnational Crime Prevention, CTCP. And very happy to back with Canberra, hopefully next month, run marathon again. That is my little bit addict, daily running. With my colleague Ryan, we work a lot after COVID with the Bali process and with the GI Talk Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime with UNODC, and recently we work with the DFED and AFP in Bangkok and Hanoi as well. PASEP is the Mekong Australian Partnership, Transnational Crime Map, TNC. Of course, now focusing on with the scam from my side. I want to sharing with over 20 years my personal experience insider and outsider when I study and graduate and lecture in the Polit Academy Vietnam before they landed in Australia currently. And compared with my previous colleagues sharing regional and gender based approaching. I'm trying to pick up my recent field works in the Vietnam based on US IP funded, focusing on in the cyber, particularly scam relating to the traffic in person, with just very specific case study in the Vietnam. Perhaps because as the last speaker, I don't want to repeat many things because Ryan and my colleagues in the AIC sharing very specific overview and detailed scale and the impacts from the scam, fox, criminalities through trafficking in the person. That is really is a concern. I think 5 years ago when the COVID started, and I'm quite lucky as one of the academic in the South Asia invited to join with the first cohort in US IP, United States Institute of Peace. We run and look for how about the trend and pattern of the scam related compound regarding to in the Mekong countries. At that time, we not only recognize COVID-19, that is the accelerates digital fraud, and through the lockdown and economics all across in the South Asia, particularly with the mainland Mekong, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, and Vietnam and Thailand as well. We look for the geography concentration. It's a cyber scam they concentrate all the South Asia, but mostly in the Cambodia, as you may know. And some of them in Laos, Myanmar, and now expanding the rest of the South Asia, like Philippines, and some in Vietnam. And this expansion of recruitment, not only those South Asia country. Currently, the last report from the UNODC and GI Talk, they found out at least 40 countries around the world involving it, becoming to the victim of the scam. That's why Bali process, they conceptualize that the global crisis, the same Interpol 2 years ago, they concern now the scam, not only one national concern, regional, but global crisis. That's why it's not only one government or regional itself and themselves can respond effectively. Of course, that is make more the security challenge for all the region, particularly in the Southeast Asia. and that many the political skeptical views, because it's in the Southeast Asia now, plus with Timor-Leste, it's quite different with the political views. For example, in my own country, my original born country, Vietnam, they follow the Communist Party leading, quite different with the conceptual line of framework legal. I will mention later slide, but it's hard to interpret is one model for the Southeast Asia itself. That is a problem. That is a problem. Well, for big picturing organization, I'm a part of and participate with the visualize and infograph with the nice position. If you still remember when the Ryan sharing, otherwise you can click on the full report in the GI Talk report. Of course, for all the position, that is a very different and distinguished the duties, stuff, etc. But perhaps tomorrow, I think we can hear very detailed from the Professor Edward Clemens sharing the criminal carriers. I think the scam, the same human trafficking as a business. They run this business. They set up the side to side. So my focusing on is a couple of next slide, focusing on the Vietnamese victim run by, operated by the Chinese cyber animal crimes. I will let detail. But early this year, January, right, when all of you may know, when the Cambodia law enforcement authorities, they arrested and extradited Chen Yi, is a CEO of the Prince Corporation, and already is back in China. But maybe that is only pause sometime, not definitely that stop everything. That's why we borrow the short big picturing organization. We're sharing from the data. We found out that is a very multiple layers, right? Hopefully tomorrow, they can call it, they elaborate with the social network analysis to jot out and find out any connection. But unfortunately, with the scam, we hope after this big case, Chen Yi, not sure until the China government they release the prosecution or judgment. For the scholar or academia, we need the data or the full detail, the transcription, and we can visualize how the criminal network analysis can apply with the scam for criminality through the trafficking in person. Well, again, I agree with both of my previous colleagues in the last section. Very blur victim, the offender next. Absolutely the same with the elder presentation this morning. Individual can both the victim or the offender situation by situation. That is a very quite different compared with my question this early morning when I linked with the 39 Vietnamese died in the lorry 2019. That is quite different. In the next slide, I compare with my new release on the Nature portfolio. I call it a simple job, high salary, quite similar with you. But that is a dominate the slang and very specific advertising over 5 years in the Southeast Asia, particularly in the Vietnam. Simple job, high salary, việc nhẹ lương cao. Almost the victims they become very contradict with the 39 the Vietnamese die. I and some of my colleagues in the UK, we still look for the insightful information to investigate what is the specific factors put and push factor put all those 39 the Vietnamese deaths in the lorry. But most of them, based on the data, we found out they follow and they identify very clearly with the long journey from the Vietnam, Mongolia, Russia, somewhere before they deported in Germany. Of course, last one is cut lines before they go to England Channel, right, in the Dover. We observed 2 years ago, it's serious, right? Particularly, I know your data is 10 years, but before the lorry strategy, but two recent years. The Vietnamese you put is a higher Albany. That is crazy, right? That is a very extraordinary questioning with the UK government. So last month, I and my colleague in Liverpool, John Mose, we returned. Because in the Vietnam, not all the 63 provinces, now we merge and reduce only 34 last year after the new administration. Not all the Vietnam. That's why I agree with the NCA and AFP as well. If you, namely, the Vietnam general, you fail again. For example, with the human trafficking or smuggling migrant or scam, they not only localize some province or some specific areas. For example, Nghệ An, Hà Tĩnh, or Quảng Bình or Hải Phòng. That is a very, very cultural feature. If we are law enforcement agency, if we are the academia, we not understand the narrow down the cultural points, we fail or generalize. That's why for the first point below between the victim offender or the overlap again with the victim offender, absolutely correct with the scam situation in the Southeast Asia. Well, again, that's really challenging for the policing because the data and my case study based on 10 court transcription, and I also combine with the interview 12 law enforcement agency I sharing later. But the mobilizing of the scam complicated, make more difficult with the law enforcement agency to survey and to manage and control. Particularly, even though the last year, as you may know, the October 2025, when Hanoi is the home of the new convention, right? UN Convention Cybercrime. But that is still a lot of the skeptical. For example, with the two big names, when 2 weeks ago we met Ryan and the other stakeholder, Google, Meta, and US or Australia as well. But for the new convention, cybercrime, both America and Singapore is not yet signed the convention when they open until now. Among the 72 countries until now, when they open, we still hope at least the end of this year, 31st December 2026, and we also need at least 40 countries ratify in order to this convention cybercrime to be effective. But again, for example, policing challenge regarding to the cybercrime in the South Asia, Singapore has considered an innovative hub where the Interpol they set up its news, they're sharing data. But if Singapore not yet sign or verify the convention, the rest of Southeast Asia, very hard one. That's why Rian or yourself sharing and request for data to be shared data, Intel share data, that is a big question. Well, for the romance, the same, very similar with your data as well. In my case study, romance investment scam and impersonating fraud dominated all the Southeast Asia. Maybe last month, when is the first crackdown campaign led by the Thai military and another 20 journalists or the other stakeholders. They found out that one is Cambodia with at least 7 police uniforms, and I has been interviewed by ABC News. Surprise? No, not surprise. Even though with the AFP and Japan or the Brazil, Indonesia, and Vietnam police uniform. That what does it mean when the scammer they use and they use the uniform to impersonate, right? Impersonate the law enforcement or authority to threat or to lure with the potential victim. That means there's a modus operandi now. It's expanded, not only the simple one like the trafficking only. They combine with the AI defects they mimic the voice, and that's why we always warning with the social media platform, Facebook, Weibo, or the WhatsApp, even though Telegram. All that is when we use open source intelligence, OSINT, the criminal same, right? And yes, complex financial ecosystem, scam operation from the Southeast Asia landscape, and just in my case study in the Vietnam, rely on the complex financial system, combining the banks, fintech, cryptocurrency, and informed transfers. That's why the methods such as the money mirrors or OTC crypto broker makes it more challenge for the law enforcement when they have to require to collaborate across jurisdiction, not only one country, but at least the other one. Of course, again, you need to require to build trust, collaborating among policing by policing. Disrupting the scam require advanced technology, but unfortunately, 5 years ago, if I'm correct, when the UN received first time survey all the Southeast Asia country law enforcement agency, how they perceive or understand with the darknet and how they respond with the darknet in Southeast Asia. But unfortunately, that very, very poor the knowledge or the background for the law enforcement when they handle or respond with the darknet. That's why, again, even though now the Thailand or Singapore, they set up, it is ASEAN, the center for high-tech or the anti-cybercrime, but the human resources capacity, particularly with the policing, that's still poor. That's why really challenge with handle complex financial ecosystem run by or operated by the scammers. Well, for the challenge for policing when deal with dual victimization or the victim offender overlaps, I totally agree with Aula or my previous sharing. That is a very, very hard one. Yeah, last year I remember the 1st June when the ASEAN they released the non-punishment principle with hope. All the ASEAN they consider very clearly victim of the scam, not offender. But that is in theory. And also Vietnam, the first country, the last year as well, they released a new law on anti-trafficking. They also the conceptualize this principle. But again, we look for the data and we look for reality, how effect, how the law enforcement they respond and accepted this non-punishment principle for the victims. It's very hard to question. Okay, come back with my case study. That is a part of the funded by USIP, and I take time in the between August and November 2023, come back Vietnam and sit down and talk with the law enforcement. Of course, very limited, only focusing on the police. In the Vietnam, when you talk about law enforcement agency, very, very variety. But police officer, always under law, they are the first hand, right? That's why I priority interview with the police officer. And period time is quite limited and not reach out with the offender and victims, but because at that time it's still very blur, as I mentioned, blurs identifying between the victim and offender. That's why I don't want to take a risk to interview those of them. And it is the reason I selected 10 case studies relating to scam, forced Vietnamese labor run by Chinese cyber and crimes. And took time and sharing discuss with my colleagues from the different background on behalf of 12 police officers in my case study. Almost this one I released in my paper last year in the Nature portfolio. simple job, high salary. That is a very Vietnamese context, but really insightful story how the policing with the new tactic, new the modus operandi from the scammers for the potential victim of the trafficking. Based on the case study in Vietnam, we found that individual or co-offender to collude directly or indirectly with the Chinese cyber animal crime through the connecting and cooperating with the Cambodia counterparts. Absolutely. Very correct until now. Please be aware that my data collected nearly 4 years ago, but now still correct. And reflect its a quite variety and how is the individual or co-offender they collude directly or indirectly with the Chinese gangs or the syndicates through connecting with Cambodia. All the 10 case study and all our interviewees confirm that point. There are different scenarios for colluding and cooperating between the Chinese animal cybercrime and I accomplish either Cambodia or the Vietnam or both. The first scenario is the absence of the direct relation between Vietnamese and Chinese subject. That is very clearly that point. Very hard to demonstrate how is the Vietnamese offender or the victims, they connect directly or under operate or monitor or control by the Chinese gangs at that time. Or in the second situation, the Vietnamese offenders was connected to the Chinese subject before, during and after recruiting and selling the victim to Cambodia. That demonstrates that it's a very consistent process. Yeah. Next slide, I illustrate with the crime script analysis, which is step by step how they recruit the potential victim, how they training, and how they threat the victim become the offender to the lure the potential customer, even their relatives or their family or friends. And however, quite interesting, no evidence confirmed that any of the Vietnamese offender in the My 10 case study belong to the Chinese groups. Yeah. And their final target is to sell Vietnamese victim to Chinese online company in Cambodia who work in the Cambodian in very different roles or did work not or come to the Cambodia while committing crime. Another point from the the evidence quite similar and also contradict with the Ryan presentation, because that all the victim or the all offender in the my case study no compulsory IT skill, because it's now with the AI or the Google translator, the technical savvy or the English not compulsory. For example, in the my case study, it's now booming with the Google, with the Gen AI, it's easier to apply, even though you without IT background or you not native speaker. Here is one is very briefly I basing on the case study number 6. It's a complicated case study. In the Vietnam, if you see the compare with the 6th position when the Ryan sharing from the GI Talk report, here I visualize with the 6 levels. The big boss at that time we don't know, but there's intel sharing or evidence. They believe, law enforcement believes the Chinese behind the scene, but it's not clear. And level 2, the management absolutely in the Cambodia, Chinese again. And the level 3 sub-managers, either Chinese, Cambodia, or very rare. Only 2 cases is a Vietnamese nominated position. But level 4, most of the supervisor or the captain or leaders, level 5 as well, mostly the Vietnamese, because they easy, they control the victim. Of course, last in the bottom up is the soldier, that is the victim. Again, it's the with the transcript analysis, we visualize based on case study number 6. We found out this very clearly, very specific lines roles among the scams, and also with the another role. They divided into very many the position, for example, manager or the recruitment design test, TOT trainer or teller sales, and the top down they have run by the admin team, and one table is a mobile desktop lab experts. All the one they test very perfectly. That's why when ABC News, the journalist asked me last month how any surprise or why they use AFP police officers uniform impersonate for their victims. That is they did. They create is a very perfect scenario, very real one. All right. Not only the police. For example, in the Vietnam, they use the judge uniform or prosecuting, and they film step by step how you have to be identify, involved with the potential case study, make the potential victim very scared and fear. Again, this one I still finalizing and hopefully submit the mid this year. Separate the paper, but look for transcript analysis to divide it step by step, based on the transcript analysis, the model and theory. In my case study in the Vietnam, separate at least for the steps, preparation, how they set up social media accounts, design to the advertising, symbols of high salary, for example, and how they lock up and training the victim become the offender, how they set up the trust between the offender, between the scammer with the potential victim, mostly virtually, right? And how they use the Fox Coxon, my colleague sharing a lot of trauma and post-trauma for those victims. From the case study, we found out many the challenge for policing regarding operation, legal, and ethic. As I mentioned, South Asia is quite different regional conceptual or legal regulation as well, and particularly with the policing, it's a very different views, a different response. That's why ASEAN Pole, sometimes I joke that on the second meeting. It's very different with the Europol, right? I suggest many times, please, maybe we can follow ZOT team investigation, ZIT. That is a very, very good model to set up and establish task force for cybercrime team to respond this the study in the South Asia. Okay, some last slide is a police recommendation that only is from my side, based on the Vietnam field work, but happy to sharing and look for the Q&A question. Again, my last point, support with my colleague as well, identifying and supporting victims of the scam for the criminality. That is a very key point if we look for the harm reduction or the human rights approaches. And thank you so much for your attention.